The air hung thick over Guadalcanal, late October 1942. 4:30 in the afternoon, and the jungle steamed beneath a copper sun that bled through the canopy in slanted beams. Mosquitoes swarmed in clouds. The smell of rotting vegetation mixed with salt water carried on a breeze that barely moved. Somewhere in the green labyrinth south of Henderson Field, a Japanese patrol, 23 men strong, moved in disciplined silence through the undergrowth. Their rifles were held low, bayonets fixed. Sweat soaked through their uniforms. They had been hunting since dawn. Hunting one man. Lieutenant Hideaki Tanaka led from the center, his eyes scanning the tree-line ahead, his jaw tight. Behind him, Sergeant Inoue whispered something about the fading light. They had maybe 90 minutes before darkness swallowed the jungle whole. And somewhere out there, invisible, patient, was the American. The one they called Kage no Haishi, the shadow soldier. A sniper who had killed 11 of their comrades in 3 days. Tanaka raised his fist. The column stopped. The jungle breathed around them, alive with cicadas and distant bird calls. Then, without warning, without sound, the man directly behind Tanaka collapsed forward into the ferns. A neat hole punched through the side of his helmet. No crack of gunfire. No muzzle flash. Just the wet thud of a body hitting earth. The horror of it was not the death itself. Death had become commonplace by the autumn of 1942. Japanese and American forces had been locked in brutal combat across the Solomon Islands for months, men dying by the hundreds in steaming jungles and along coral beaches. What unnerved Tanaka's patrol was the invisibility of it, the precision, the silence that followed each kill, as if the jungle itself had reached out and plucked one of them away. This was not the warfare they had trained for. Not the close-quarters bayonet charges through Chinese villages, not the coordinated infantry assaults that had carried them across Malaya and the Philippines. This was something else, something that felt personal and surgical and impossibly patient. By late 1942, the myth of Japanese invincibility had begun to crack. The naval battle of Midway in June had shattered the confidence of the Imperial fleet. Guadalcanal was supposed to be different, a chance to reassert dominance, to push the Americans back into the sea. But the island had become a meat grinder. Both sides fed men into the jungle, and the jungle consumed them. Malaria, dysentery, artillery, machine gun nests, and now snipers. The American sniper doctrine was still evolving. Unlike their Japanese counterparts, who had long traditions of marksmen embedded within infantry units, the U.S. Marine Corps was only beginning to understand the psychological and tactical value of a single rifleman with patience and skill. But the lessons were being learned in blood. On Guadalcanal, a handful of Marine snipers, men who had been hunters, farm boys, marksmen in civilian life, were being unleashed into the jungle with scoped rifles and a simple mandate: disrupt, demoralize, kill. The man hunting Tanaka's patrol was one of these. His name, for the purposes of this story, was Corporal Jack Brennan, though in truth he might have been any of a dozen young Americans who carried the Springfield M1903 with an unertl scope into the green hell of the Pacific. He was 24 years old. He had grown up in the mountains of West Virginia, where his father had taught him to shoot squirrels at 200 yards before he was 10. He had learned patience in those hills, learned to move through forest without snapping twigs, learned to read wind and light and shadow. The Marine Corps had given him a rifle and pointed him toward the Japanese. Everything else, the craft of killing from distance, the stillness required, the weight of taking a man's life through magnified glass, he had taught himself. Brennan had been in position since before dawn. He had chosen his spot carefully, a shallow depression beneath the roots of a massive banyan tree, 230 yards from the trail the Japanese were using. He had draped himself in camouflage netting woven with ferns and moss. He had smeared mud across his face and hands. He did not move except to shift his eyes, to blink away sweat, to breathe in shallow, controlled intervals. His rifle lay across a moss-covered log, the crosshairs of the unertl scope steady on the trail below. He had counted the Japanese soldiers as they passed, 23 men, 1 officer. He had watched them pause, confer, scan the jungle. He had watched the tension in their shoulders, the way their heads swiveled at every sound. They knew he was out here. They just didn't know where. He had already taken his first shot an hour earlier, dropping the rear scout with a bullet through the chest. The patrol had frozen, scattered, reformed. They had fired blindly into the jungle for 2 minutes, wasting ammunition on shadows. Then they had continued, more cautiously now, their nerves fraying. Brennan had waited. Patience was the sniper's greatest weapon. More than marksmanship, more than camouflage, more than fieldcraft. Patience allowed you to become part of the landscape, to let the enemy's fear do half the work. Now, as the patrol halted again, Brennan adjusted his aim. Through the scope, he could see the faces of individual men. Young faces, exhausted, afraid. He could see the officer, a lieutenant, by the insignia, holding up a fist, scanning the canopy. Brennan's breathing slowed. His heartbeat steadied. He placed the crosshairs on the soldier directly behind the officer. Center mass. He squeezed the trigger. The rifle bucked softly against his shoulder. The suppressor he had jury-rigged from captured materials muffled the report to a dull thump, barely audible beyond 50 yards. Through the scope, he watched the soldier crumple. The Japanese soldiers around the body reacted instantly, dropping, scattering, shouting. But they were shouting at ghosts. Brennan had already shifted position, low-crawling 10 yards to his left, dragging his rifle behind him. He slid into a new firing position behind a fallen log, invisible again. Below, the patrol was in disarray. The officer was screaming orders, trying to regain control. 3 men were firing blindly into the jungle to the west, exactly where Brennan had been 30 seconds ago. The symbolism of the scoped rifle became, in that moment, something more than a tool. It represented a shift in the nature of warfare, a movement away from mass formations and heroic charges towards something colder, more calculated. The sniper did not need courage in the traditional sense. He needed discipline. He did not face his enemy in open battle. He erased them from a distance, methodically, one by one. To the Japanese soldiers pinned in that jungle clearing, the American sniper was not a warrior. He was a phantom, a demon, an affront to every code of Bushido that emphasized facing death with honor. Tanaka knew they were running out of time. The sun was sinking fast, and in the jungle, darkness came quickly and absolutely. If they didn't locate the sniper before sunset, he would melt into the night, and they would be forced to withdraw or risk being picked off in the dark. He had already lost 3 men today, 4, counting the one just killed. His orders had been clear: eliminate the American sniper who had been terrorizing their supply lines. But how do you eliminate a ghost? He split his men into 3 groups. One would continue forward along the trail, drawing fire. The other 2 would flank wide, moving through the jungle to the north and south, attempting to triangulate the sniper's position. It was a sound tactic. Brennan watched them divide through his scope. He understood immediately what they were attempting. He had perhaps 10 minutes before the flanking elements moved into positions that would compromise his hide. He needed to act. He shifted his aim to the lead group, the bait. 5 men, moving cautiously forward, glancing constantly over their shoulders. He selected the second man in the file, not the point man, who would be expected to draw fire, but the man behind him, the one who thought he was safe. Brennan exhaled slowly, letting half his breath out, holding the rest. The crosshairs settled. He squeezed. The rifle thumped. The soldier fell. Instantly, the remaining 4 men dove for cover, returning fire in a wild spray toward the wrong hillside. Brennan was already moving again, this time crawling backward, deeper into the undergrowth. He had a fallback position prepared, a shallow spider hole he had dug that morning, 30 yards upslope, covered with branches and leaves. He slithered into it, pulling the camouflage over himself, and went perfectly still. For the next 20 minutes, the jungle became a theater of confusion and mounting dread. The Japanese soldiers fired at shadows, at sounds, at the rustle of leaves that might have been wind or might have been death. They shouted to each other, trying to coordinate, but the jungle swallowed their voices. Tanaka's flanking groups had moved into position but found nothing. No brass casings, no trampled grass, no sign that anyone had been there at all. The American was a ghost. Worse, he was a ghost who was winning. From his spider hole, Brennan could hear them thrashing through the undergrowth below. He could hear their voices, sharp with fear and frustration. He did not move. He barely breathed. A Japanese soldier passed within 10 feet of him, so close Brennan could see the man's hands shaking on his rifle. The soldier paused, looked directly at the mound of leaves and branches that concealed Brennan, and then moved on. The art of the sniper was not merely shooting, it was becoming invisible. It was understanding that the human eye was drawn to movement, to contrast, to patterns that did not belong. Brennan's camouflage was not perfect, but it was good enough. And good enough, in war, was the difference between life and death. The sun touched the horizon. The light shifted from copper to amber to deep orange. The jungle began to darken. Tanaka made the decision. They would withdraw. He had lost 5 men. No, 6 now, counting the one who had stepped on a concealed root and twisted his ankles so badly he had to be carried. They had not even seen the American. Not once. They had fired hundreds of rounds into empty jungle. They had accomplished nothing except to feed the legend of the shadow soldier. As the patrol began its retreat, moving faster now, desperate to reach their lines before full darkness, Brennan emerged from his hide. He did not pursue. That was not the sniper's role. He had done what he came to do. He had sown fear, disrupted their operations, forced them to waste time and resources hunting him. He had broken their morale. He packed his rifle carefully, drank water from his canteen, and began the slow, methodical journey back toward American lines. The jungle was darkening fast. He moved by memory and instinct, following landmarks he had memorized that morning. Behind him, the Japanese patrols stumbled through the undergrowth, jumping at every sound, seeing snipers in every shadow. They would make it back to their camp. They would report the day's losses. And tomorrow, they would be more afraid. The psychological impact of a sniper far exceeded the numerical casualties he inflicted. One man with a rifle, properly employed, could paralyze an entire company. Not through mass killing, but through the creation of an environment where death was random, invisible, and inevitable. The Japanese had their own sniper traditions. Men who climbed into treetops and waited for days, surviving on handfuls of rice, achieving near-mythical kill counts. But the Pacific jungle was different from the forests of Manchuria or China. The terrain was thicker, the distances shorter, the conditions more brutal. And the Americans were learning fast. They were adapting. They were taking farm boys and hunters, men who understood patience and fieldcraft, and turning them into instruments of psychological warfare. By the time Brennan reached the marine perimeter, full darkness had fallen. He identified himself to the sentries, gave the day's password, and slipped through the wire. He was debriefed by a weary intelligence officer who took notes on the patrol's size, direction, and behavior. Brennan reported 6 confirmed kills. The officer nodded, wrote it down, and told him to get some rest. There was no fanfare, no congratulations. This was simply the work. The next morning, Brennan would go back into the jungle. And the morning after that, until the island was secured, or until his luck ran out. That night, Tanaka sat in his command tent, writing a report by candlelight. He did not mention the fear that had gripped his men. He did not mention the disarray, the wild firing, the retreat. He wrote in clinical terms, "Enemy sniper activity continues. Estimated 1 to 3 American marksmen operating in Sector 7. Patrols advised to increase vigilance. Request additional counter-sniper support." But when he put down his pen and closed his eyes, he saw the man behind him falling without sound. He saw the confusion, the helplessness. He saw his soldiers firing at nothing. The American had not just outwitted them. He had humiliated them. And there was nothing Tanaka could do about it except send more men into the jungle tomorrow, knowing that some of them would not come back. The mythology of the American sniper grew with each passing day. Japanese soldiers began to speak in hushed tones of the Kagen no Haishi, attributing to them almost supernatural abilities. It was said they could see through walls, that they never missed, that they could move through jungle without disturbing a single leaf. None of this was true, of course, but truth mattered less than perception. Fear was its own kind of weapon. The reality was far more mundane. Brennan was a skilled shooter, yes, but he was not superhuman. He missed shots. He got malaria. He suffered from trench foot and dysentery like every other man on the island. He was haunted by the faces he saw through his scope, by the weight of taking life from a distance, by the knowledge that he was very good at something that required him to kill other human beings with cold precision. But the Japanese did not see that. They saw the results. Officers shot dead mid-sentence, supply convoys disrupted, patrols forced to move in terror. They saw an enemy who struck without warning and disappeared without trace. And so the legend grew. In the weeks that followed, the Americans began to win Guadalcanal. Not because of snipers alone, though they played their part, but because of cumulative pressure, superior logistics, and the gradual erosion of Japanese air and naval support. By early February 1943, the Japanese High Command made the decision to evacuate the island. It was dressed up in official language as a strategic withdrawal, but everyone knew the truth. Guadalcanal was a defeat, the first major land defeat Japan had suffered in the war. And in the after-action reports, buried among the statistics of artillery barges and infantry assaults, there were brief mentions of sniper activity, of the toll it had taken, of the fear it had created. Brennan survived the war. He returned to West Virginia in 1945, a quiet man who did not speak much about what he had done. He worked in a coal mine, married a local woman, raised 3 children. He died in 1983, and his obituary mentioned his military service in a single sentence. His rifle, the Springfield M1903 that had killed dozens of men across the Pacific, was donated to a small museum in Charleston, where it sits today behind glass, polished and silent. The story of that October afternoon in the Guadalcanal jungle is not recorded in any official history. There is no plaque, no monument, no detailed after-action report that lays out exactly what happened. But it exists in fragments, in patrol logs that mention casualties, in intelligence summaries that reference sniper activity, in the memories of men who were there. And it exists in the broader truth of the Pacific War, that technology, tactics, and psychology were evolving faster than doctrine could keep pace. The sniper with his scoped rifle represented a new kind of warfare, asymmetric, patient, psychologically devastating. The Japanese infantry who hunted him that day were not cowards. They were professional soldiers, veterans of a dozen campaigns, men who had faced death many times. But they were facing something they did not fully understand. An enemy who did not charge, who did not announce himself, who simply erased them one by one from a distance. It was not the warfare of honor and glory that their culture had prepared them for. It was cold, mechanical, modern, and it terrified them. The symbolism of the scoped rifle echoes through the decades. In Vietnam, in Iraq, in Afghanistan, the sniper remains a figure of myth and fear. The technology has evolved. Thermal optics, ballistic computers, rifles capable of killing at a mile or more. But the essential truth remains unchanged. One man, properly trained, properly positioned, properly patient, can dominate a battlefield far beyond his physical presence. He can make an entire enemy force afraid to move, afraid to speak, afraid to show themselves in daylight. As the sun set over Guadalcanal that October evening in 1942, Lieutenant Tanaka and his surviving men stumbled back into their defensive perimeter. They were exhausted, demoralized, and deeply shaken. They had gone into the jungle hunting a man and had been hunted in return. They had fired hundreds of rounds and hit nothing. They had lost 6 men to an enemy they never saw. That night, around their campfires, the Japanese soldiers spoke in low voices about the American sniper. Some said he was a demon. Others said he was a machine, incapable of fear or hesitation. A few of the older veterans said he was simply very good at his job, and that was more frightening than any supernatural explanation. Because if he was just a man, one man among thousands of Americans pouring into the Pacific, then what did that say about the war they were fighting? What did it say about their chances of victory? In the American lines, Brennan cleaned his rifle by the light of a kerosene lantern. He worked methodically, running patches through the barrel, wiping down the bolt, checking the scope mounts. The ritual of maintenance was soothing, a return to order after the chaos of the day. He did not think of himself as a hero. He did not revel in his kills. He had done a job, and tomorrow he would do it again. That was all. But in doing that job, in outsmarting and outlasting an enemy patrol through skill and patience, he had become part of something larger. He had become a symbol of the evolving nature of war, of the ways in which technology and training could multiply the effectiveness of a single soldier. He had become, in the minds of his enemies, a ghost, a shadow, a nightmare. The lesson of Guadalcanal, and of snipers like Brennan, was not lost on military strategists. In the years that followed, sniper training would become formalized, institutionalized, refined into a science. The skills that Brennan had learned hunting squirrels in the West Virginia hills would be taught in schools, codified in manuals, passed down through generations of soldiers. The sniper would become a permanent fixture of modern warfare, a specialist whose presence on the battlefield could shape the behavior of entire units. But on that October evening in 1942, none of that was clear. What was clear was that one man with a rifle had dominated a jungle clearing for an entire day. He had killed 6 enemy soldiers without being seen. He had forced a numerically superior force to retreat in fear. And he had done it not through brute strength or overwhelming firepower, but through patience, skill, and an intimate understanding of the terrain. The Japanese patrol that hunted him would carry the memory of that day for the rest of their lives. Those who survived the war, at least. They would remember the frustration, the helplessness, the awful realization that they were being picked off one by an enemy they could not locate, could not engage, could not defeat. They would remember the way the jungle seemed to turn against them, every shadow a potential threat, every rustle of leaves a harbinger of death. And they would remember the sunset, the fading light that marked the end of their hunt and the beginning of their retreat. They had been outsmarted, outweighted, outfought, by one man, by a ghost in the jungle. As darkness swallowed Guadalcanal that night, the jungle fell silent except for the endless chorus of insects and the distant rumble of artillery. Somewhere in the green darkness, Brennan slept fitfully, his rifle within arm's reach, his mind already planning tomorrow's hunt. And somewhere in the Japanese lines, Tanaka stared at the ceiling of his tent, unable to sleep, replaying the day's events over and over, searching for the mistake he had made, the moment when he had lost control. He found no answer. There was no mistake. There was only the reality that his enemy had been better prepared, better positioned, and better trained for this particular kind of warfare. It was a bitter truth to swallow. The symbolic weight of that afternoon, one American sniper against an entire Japanese patrol, would ripple outward through the months and years that followed. It would be repeated in 100 different jungles, on a dozen different islands. American snipers would become a feared presence throughout the Pacific, their reputation growing with each kill, each narrow escape, each impossible shot. And the Japanese, despite their own sniper traditions, would struggle to counter them effectively. The jungle favored the patient, the invisible, the still. And in that environment, the American sniper was king. Decades later, military historians would analyze the Battle of Guadalcanal through the lens of logistics, air superiority, and naval engagements. They would chart troop movements, artillery barges, disease rates. They would identify the turning points, the key decisions, the strategic errors that led to Japanese defeat. But buried in the footnotes, in the casualty reports and patrol logs, would be the evidence of smaller battles. Battles fought by individual men with rifles, in clearings and ridges and river crossings, where the outcome was determined not by numbers or firepower, but by skill and nerve and luck. The story of Corporal Jack Brennan, or whatever his real name was, for he represents a composite of many such men, is not a story of glory or heroism in the traditional sense. It is a story of craftsmanship, of a man who was very good at a difficult job, who did that job under terrifying conditions, and who survived to go home. It is a story about the evolution of warfare, about the way technology and training can create asymmetric advantages, about the psychological dimensions of combat. It is a story about fear, the fear of the hunted, and the quiet, controlled fear of the hunter. And it is a story about that October afternoon, when the sun hung low over Guadalcanal, and one American sniper outsmarted an entire Japanese patrol before sunset. Not through luck, not through divine intervention, but through patience, preparation, and an understanding of his craft that bordered on artistry. The Japanese soldiers who survived that day would tell the story to others, and the story would grow in the telling. The numbers would change. 6 dead would become 12, then 20. The distance would stretch. 200 yards would become 400, then 6. The sniper would acquire mythical qualities. He never missed. He could see in the dark. He was part Indian, part ghost. But the core truth remained unchanged. They had been hunting him, and he had turned the hunt around. He had become the predator, and they had become prey. And when the light failed and they retreated into the gathering darkness, they carried with them the knowledge that the jungle belonged to him, not to them. That the war they were fighting was not the war they had expected. That the enemy they faced was more adaptable, more innovative, more terrifying than they had been prepared for. In the end, the story of that afternoon is not about victory or defeat in any grand strategic sense. Guadalcanal would be won or lost through the cumulative weight of 1,000 such encounters, through the grinding attrition of men and material, through the slow strangulation of Japanese supply lines, and the steady buildup of American forces. But in the microcosm of that jungle clearing, in the space between sunrise and sunset on a sweltering October day, a fundamental truth of modern warfare revealed itself, that the individual soldier, properly trained and equipped, could still matter. That skill could triumph over numbers. That patience could defeat aggression. That one man, if he was good enough, could change the calculus of an entire battlefield. The sun set over Guadalcanal. The jungle grew dark, and somewhere in that darkness, a sniper cleaned his rifle, ate a cold ration, and prepared to do it all again tomorrow. Because the war was not over. Because there were more patrols to hunt, more targets to eliminate, more fear to sow. Because this was his job, and he was very, very good at it. The Japanese infantry couldn't believe it. But belief was irrelevant. The reality was written in the bodies of their fallen comrades, in the frayed nerves of the survivors, in the reports that traveled up the chain of command. The Americans had a weapon that the Japanese were struggling to counter. Not a rifle, not a scope, not even a tactic, but a philosophy, a commitment to individual excellence, to training men who could think and adapt and fight alone, to creating soldiers who were more than cogs in a machine, who were themselves small, deadly machines, capable of operating independently, of making decisions under fire, of dominating a battlefield through sheer competence. That was the lesson of Guadalcanal. That was the lesson Tanaka learned in the most painful way possible. And that was the lesson that would echo through the Pacific War, from island to island, from jungle to jungle, until the final surrender in Tokyo Bay. The American sniper, patient, invisible, lethal, became one of the enduring symbols of that war. Not because he killed the most enemy soldiers, but because he represented a new way of thinking about combat, a way that emphasized quality over quantity, skill over courage, intelligence over brute force. The Japanese had built an empire on the strength of their infantry, on the ferocity of their assaults, on the willingness of their soldiers to die for the emperor. But in the green hell of the Pacific jungles, that philosophy met its match. Because the Americans were not interested in dying gloriously. They were interested in winning efficiently. And the sniper, more than any other soldier, embodied that principle. He did not charge into battle. He waited. He watched. He calculated. And when the moment was right, he pulled the trigger. One shot, one kill. No wasted effort. No unnecessary risk. Clean. Professional. Effective. The Japanese infantry couldn't believe it. But by the time they understood what they were facing, it was already too late. The war had moved on. The tide had turned. And the shadow soldier, the Kagen no Haishi, had become a permanent fixture of the battlefield. A ghost that would haunt them until the very end.